You can still find the address if you know where to look. Colby Street, red brick, 4 floors, a courtyard with one dead tree in the middle. Between March and November of 1986, 4 different families moved into apartment 2B. Every single one of them left inside a month, and none of them would explain why, not to neighbors, not to the landlord, not even to each other. The building manager kept a private logbook of every tenant who passed through his door, 1 line each, the date they left, and the reason they gave. For 3 of the 4 families, that line was ordinary. For the 4th, he wrote something else entirely. He wrote a question, and as far as anyone knows, he never answered it himself. Colby Street sat 2 blocks from the river, in a part of the city that had been fashionable once, and was now simply old. The building at number 19 had been converted from a textile warehouse in 1951. It kept its high ceilings and its iron radiators, and it kept its reputation as a decent, unremarkable place to live. The manager was a man named Arthur Voss, 61 years old, a widower who had run the building for 2 decades without a single complaint worth remembering. He liked routine. He liked quiet tenants. He liked apartment 2B least of all the units, though for years he could not have told you why. The apartment itself gave no obvious reason for concern. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, a window facing the courtyard tree. Previous tenants had lived there for 6 years, 8 years, once for 11 years, without incident. Nothing about the walls or the floor suggested anything unusual. Arthur had painted it himself twice. He had replaced the boiler in 1982. He knew every pipe and every floorboard, and none of them had ever given him reason to hesitate before renting it out again. Then, in March of 1986, that changed. The Alden family moved in on a Tuesday, a mother, a father, and a boy of 9. They seemed pleased with the space. The mother mentioned the light in the kitchen. The father asked about parking. Arthur wrote their names in his ledger, the way he always did. 1 line, nothing more. He had no reason yet to write anything else. By the 2nd week of April, the Aldens were gone. They left on a Sunday morning, furniture still half-packed into a rented truck, and they did not stop to sign the paperwork that would have released their deposit. Arthur asked the father why, standing in the empty courtyard with the truck engine running. The father looked at him for a long moment before answering. He said only that his son had stopped sleeping and that he would not say what kept him awake. Arthur wrote it down anyway, in his own words, because it was the only answer he had. He assumed a bad dream, a difficult adjustment, nothing more. He listed the unit as vacant again the following week and told himself, as landlords do, that some families simply did not suit some apartments. The 2nd family arrived in May. Their name was Reyes, a young couple with no children, both of them working long hours at a hospital across town. Arthur liked them immediately. They were quiet, punctual with rent, the kind of tenants a building manager remembers fondly for years afterward. He expected nothing unusual, and for the first 2 weeks, nothing unusual happened. It was Mrs. Reyes who came to his office first, on a Thursday evening, alone. She asked him a strange question. She wanted to know if anyone had ever complained about footsteps in the apartment above 2B. Arthur told her the truth, that there was no apartment above 2B, that the unit sat directly beneath the roof. She nodded slowly, as though she had expected that answer and had hoped, somehow, to be wrong. She did not explain further that night. Arthur assumed she was tired, or mistaken about which walls she had heard. It was only later, once the couple had also broken their lease and moved out within the month, that he understood she had not been asking about noise from above at all. She had been asking carefully, without wanting to say it outright, whether the sound came from somewhere else. Mr. Reyes was more direct on the day they left. He told Arthur, without apology, that his wife had begun counting something in her sleep. Numbers, evenly spaced, over and over, always stopping at the same point before starting again. He said he did not believe in anything he could not explain, and that this was exactly why he needed to leave. Arthur wrote the line in his ledger. Reason for departure, personal circumstances. He told himself it was the honest professional thing to write, even though he suspected, somewhere beneath that honesty, that it was also the easiest. He kept the Ray's couple's forwarding address for weeks afterward, longer than the paperwork required. He told himself he needed it in case the deposit dispute went further, though it never did. What he actually wanted, though he did not say this even in his own notebook, was a reason to call Mrs. Reyes and ask her one more question. He wanted to know exactly where in the apartment she had stood when she first heard the sound she would not name. He never made the call. Some part of him already suspected he did not want the answer confirmed out loud by a second person. By June, Arthur had stopped telling himself the coincidence meant nothing. 2 families, 2 abrupt departures, 2 mentions of something heard rather than seen. He began keeping notes beyond the ledger. In a separate notebook he did not show to the building's owner. He wrote down dates. He wrote down the exact words each tenant had used, as closely as he could remember them. He was not yet willing to call it a pattern. He was only willing to call it worth watching. He walked through apartment 2B alone one evening in late June, after the Ray's family had gone and before anyone knew had signed a lease. He stood in the boy's old bedroom, then in the narrow hallway, then by the kitchen window overlooking the courtyard tree. He heard nothing but the ordinary sounds of an old building settling in the evening heat. He told himself that was proof enough that there was nothing to find. Still, he found himself listening differently after that. When he passed the courtyard at night, he counted his own footsteps without meaning to, and stopped himself, faintly embarrassed, halfway across the yard. He mentioned none of this to his wife's memory, which he still spoke to sometimes in the quiet of his office. He mentioned it to no one at all. He did not mention the notebook in his desk drawer, or the 2 identical departures, or the boy who would not say what kept him awake, or the wife who asked about footsteps that would. The building's owner asked him, near the end of June, why apartment 2B had been vacant for 3 weeks. Arthur gave the same answer he always gave. Slow season, nothing more. Could not exist. He told himself, again, that he was a practical man, and that practical men did not build ghost stories out of bad sleep and a nervous question. He believed this most of the time. It was only late at night, alone in the office below the courtyard, that he was less certain. He began, without quite deciding to, keeping a separate page for anything involving numbers. A count, a distance, a repeated word. It felt foolish even as he did it, like a man building a filing system for something he refused to admit he believed in. He told himself the page would stay empty, that no future tenant would ever give him anything to write on it. He kept the notebook locked in his desk drawer regardless, and found himself checking, more than once a week, that the lock had held. The 3rd family moved into apartment 2B in early July, and this time Arthur watched more closely than he had before. They were an older couple, retired, with a grown daughter who visited on weekends. He told himself their age and their steadiness would break whatever pattern he had imagined. For 19 days, it seemed he was right. On the 20th day, the husband came to his office and asked, in an oddly formal way, whether anyone had ever died in the building. Arthur answered honestly, 2 tenants had died of natural causes over the decades, both elderly, both in units far from 2B. The husband nodded and thanked him and said nothing further. But Arthur noticed he did not look relieved by the answer. He looked as though he had been hoping for a different explanation, one that would account for something specific. Arthur asked him directly what had prompted the question. He said that both he and his wife had begun hearing, late at night, a sound like someone pacing a fixed distance across the bedroom floor, always the same number of steps, always. The husband hesitated for a long time before answering, stopping at the same point near the window. He said his wife had started counting along with it, without realizing she was doing so, the same way a person hums along to a song they cannot place. They left 4 days later. This time Arthur did not write personal circumstances in his ledger. He wrote, for the first time, a fuller sentence, describing exactly what the husband had told him. That night he sat in his office long after his usual hour, the notebook open in front of him, and had admitted to himself for the first time that 3 families leaving for the same. He underlined nothing. He added no opinion of his own. He simply recorded it, the way a man records something he suspects he will need to remember precisely. Unexplainable reason was no longer a coincidence by any definition he was willing to defend. He considered, briefly, telling the building's owner everything. He imagined the conversation, the careful wording he would need, the certainty that he would sound like a man asking to be pensioned off early for his own good. He wrote a note to himself, dated and precise, stating plainly that if a 4th family ever reported the same sound, he would take some action, though even as he wrote it, he could. He decided against it. Instead, he did the only thing that felt within his authority, not say what that action would actually be. He should have left the apartment empty. He knew this even as he placed the advertisement again in August. But the building's owner wanted the income, and Arthur had no evidence he could put in front of anyone that would justify an empty unit indefinitely. A story about footsteps and counting was not evidence. It was, he told himself, exactly the kind of thing a 61-year-old man should be embarrassed to repeat out loud. The 4th family answered the advertisement within a week. A single mother, Elena Castillo, and her son, Marcus, 10 years old, quiet, careful, the kind of boy who read at the kitchen table instead of watching television. Arthur met them both during the walk-through, and found himself hoping, more than he usually allowed himself to hope about anything, that this time would be different. He almost told Elena everything. He stood in the doorway of 2B, with the lease still unsigned in his hand, and for a moment he considered describing exactly what had happened to the 3 families before her. He told himself it would sound absurd, that he had no proof, that a responsible building manager did not frighten a single mother out of a fair apartment with a story he could not, substantiate. He handed her the lease instead, and she signed it without hesitation. They moved in on the last Saturday of August. Arthur watched the boy carry a box of books through the doorway, and told himself one more time that this family would be the one to break the pattern, simply because he needed. Marcus chose the bedroom that had once belonged to the Alden boy, the same room where a 9-year-old had stopped sleeping 5 months earlier. Badly, for someone finally to be. He checked on them more than he checked on any other tenant, more than professional courtesy required. He found reasons to walk past the courtyard in the evening. She always answered that everything was fine, and for 3 weeks she was telling him the truth, which was the longest stretch of ordinary calm apartment 2B had offered anyone. He asked Elena whenever he saw her whether everything was comfortable, whether the boiler was keeping the apartment warm enough as the nights turned cooler. Since March. For 3 weeks, nothing happened, and Arthur allowed himself to believe he had been right to hope. Then, on a Tuesday in late September, Helena came to his office in the middle of the afternoon, which she had never done before. She asked whether the building had ever had trouble with the water pipes making noise at night. Arthur told her the truth. The pipes in that section of the building had been replaced in 1982, and they were quiet by design. She did not seem surprised by the answer, only tired. When she asked what counting, He described footsteps moving back and forth across his bedroom floor, always the same distance, always the same number, stopping every time at the 8th. She explained that Marcus had begun waking her most nights around 2 in the morning, standing in her doorway, asking if she could hear the count. Same point near the window before starting again from the beginning. Arthur asked as gently as he could manage. What number Marcus said he was hearing? 41. Then a pause. Then 41 again, as though the walker crossed the same 41 steps every single time and refused, for reasons no living person could explain. Elena said her son always gave the same answer, ever to reach a 42nd. Arthur wrote this down that evening with a steadiness he did not entirely feel. He noted that this was the first time any tenant had offered him a specific number, rather than a vague description of pacing or counting. He underlined the number once, then crossed the line out, uncertain why he had underlined it at all. He did not sleep well that night, and he told himself it was only the late hour, nothing more. He went back through his notebook that same evening, page by page, looking for anything he might have missed in the earlier accounts. The Alden father had never mentioned a number. Mrs. Reyes had never mentioned one either, only a rhythm she could not place. It was only Marcus, 10 years old, careful and precise in the way certain children are, who had managed to count something the adults before him had only felt. Arthur found himself wondering uneasily whether the boy had simply been the first tenant patient enough to listen all the way to the end. It was only the following morning, when she went to wake her son for school, that she found him sitting upright at the foot of his bed, awake, silent, staring at a point on theme. On the 2nd of October, Marcus did not wake his mother. Elena told Arthur later that she had assumed hopefully that the counting had simply stopped, while near the window where nothing was visible to anyone else. She asked him what was wrong. He did not answer for nearly a full minute. He said he had counted along without meaning to, the way his mother once counted along without meaning to, and that somewhere past 60 he had lost the ability to keep counting. When he finally spoke, he told her that the footsteps had not stopped at 41 the night before. For the first time, they had continued. At all, not because the sound had grown quieter, but because it had grown closer. Elena called Arthur before 8 that morning. She told him only that they would be leaving that day, that she did not want to discuss the reason further, and that she would forfeit the deposit rather than remain in the. He had stopped arguing with tenants about apartment 2B 5 months earlier, somewhere around the second family's departure, though he had never admitted that to himself until. Her voice was steady in a way that frightened him more than panic would have, building one additional night. Arthur did not argue this exact moment. He helped them carry boxes to the car in silence. Marcus did not look back at the building once. She told him that her son had asked her, calmly, whether it was possible for something to have been walking that same distance in that same room for so long that it had simply. Elena thanked Arthur at the curb, briefly, and then said one more thing before she drove away, something she had clearly been holding back the entire morning. Forgotten how to stop. Arthur stood in the courtyard long after the car had turned the corner, the dead tree beside him doing nothing to block the morning sun. He thought about the number 41, and about how a boy who had never heard the earlier accounts had arrived, independently, at a figure the others had only circled around. He thought about 11 years of ordinary tenants before the Aldens, and wondered for the first time what exactly had changed in that apartment sometime before March. Arthur went back to apartment 2B alone that evening, for the first time since his walk through with Elena in August. He reached 41 steps at the window and stopped there, not because anything forced him to, but because the number had already become, in his mind, a kind of boundary he did. He stood in Marcus's old bedroom, and paced it himself, slowly, counting under his breath without deciding to. Not one to cross on purpose. He never rented the apartment again. He told the building's owner it needed extensive repairs that would take considerable time, a lie sturdy enough that no one questioned it for years. He kept the unit locked, the utilities minimal, the courtyard tree outside its window trimmed the same as any other. To anyone glancing up from the street, apartment 2B looked exactly like every other window in the building. In his private notebook, in the final entry concerning the fourth family, Arthur did not write a reason for departure the way he had for the others. Whether that was because he did not know one, or because he suspected the answer and preferred not to see it written in his own hand, no one who read the notebook after him could. He wrote a single question instead, the same one Marcus had asked his mother at the curb, copied down word for word. He never wrote an answer beneath it. Say for certain. Arthur Voss managed the building on Colby Street for 11 more years before he retired. He never spoke about apartment 2B to anyone who worked there after him, and the notebook was found only after his death, tucked behind a shelf of old maintenance records. Whoever found it read every entry twice, the way people do when a stranger's private handwriting turns out to describe something they were not prepared to take seriously. And if you were to walk the length of that particular bedroom floor today, slowly, counting as you went, there's nothing to stop you from finding out for yourself exactly how far. The building still stands. The courtyard tree is taller now. 41 steps actually carries you toward that window. If you had heard those 41 steps stop for the first time in your own hallway, would you have stayed until morning, or would you already be in the car? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe if you want the next one waiting for you.